family of origin. There's alcohol dependency, alcoholism, and I have three generations of that going on in my family. My mother suffered from mental illness. She was diagnosed as schizophrenic, and I encountered childhood sexual abuse. Where some of the stigma still looms large is in my family. My older brother and my younger brother will not talk about the trauma my family went through. So I think it's been an ongoing thing as I've had, worked on recovery from all three of those things. Probably most publicly would be the substance use disorder stuff through, peer support, community peer support programs, because that is so public. The mental health stuff, a little less so, although it's, as I look back, and I haven't thought about this in a while, that, I was a clergy person for a while. And in Maine, I was part of the Religious Outreach Committee of the Alliance for the Mentally Ill. One of the things that committee did was try to raise awareness in the community and reduce stigma. They had a family training plan where I was one of the first family trainers in the state to go into Calais at the time and co-teach a group on family mental illness. And they asked me if I would share my story. And I said, that's not what we signed up for. I want to teach people. And they asked me to share my story. So in some ways, that was when I came out around my family mental health stuff and told the story, which was, as it is any time you tell your story. It's a mixed bag. It's hard, but it's also liberating. And then lastly, the sexual abuse stuff's been the last train on the station in some ways, because even still, there's still a lot of stigma around that. And but a few years ago, I co-facilitated a group from male survivors of sexual abuse in Farmington. And, it's about breaking trauma. And I've met other people in recovery for that and some of the same other issues who are getting more and more vocal. The idea that people need to see us not as recovering, out of the range of the light, but rather that we're in the community doing what we can. And so then, then I've been in the field for, 15, 20 years now, and dealing with the trauma in the community related to the people I'm working with. So the stigma around that's been something I've been trying to work on as well. I mean, even when I started, I now work, and I have worked for the last 12 years in medication-assisted treatment. It used to be opiate replacement therapy. When I was taking my training to get my CCS, there was a guy in my group who was doing MAT, and I was all about abstinence at that point, and I had my own prejudice. And then as things shifted, I became one of the first CCSs in the state to be godfathered in. I ended up finding a position open at Discovery House down in South Portland, which is a medication-assisted treatment program. Because they didn't have anybody, when the regulation changed, they didn't have any on staff who could do supervision. So I took the job, and that was my education around the stigma against opiate use and opiate use treatment. So it's in the field. You still have a lot of abstinence-based people who are very uncomfortable with the idea of medication-assisted treatment. Then it's certainly in the community. But, Bangor's been one of the areas where they've been working hard on reducing stigma to a large degree, I think. I think where we go from here is to be trying to reach affected others, family members. And working in the field, we're kind of getting an interesting pattern. We're seeing multi-generational opiate addiction, but dealing mostly with the middle generation. But we're having kids who are certainly already being affected. I think of the numbers sometimes, and I used to work in the clinic where we had hundreds of patients, and I think about how many affected others must there be in the Bangor area. I started to go to Naranan, which is Naranan is for the affected others of narcotics addicts. It's one of the most painful places you can go, but at least people are starting to get help. But I don't know that a lot of those people coming in there are also getting professional support. In the clinics we work in, it's very hard to reach that population. And I think they're key because they have a lot of pain. They have a lot of ignorance around addiction. And like the Mothers Against Drunk Driving, I think when they catch it, they're going to be a force for cultural change. And faith-based communities is where we need to go. That's one of my burdens, as we say, in that subculture, is to try to connect the recovery community to the faith-based community, and to help churches, faith-based communities, to be sensitive to trauma. If I can get biblical for a second, I do some supply preaching. One of the things that was interesting to me a few years ago is I discovered that all the symptoms of PTSD are in the Genesis 3 story of the fall. Look it up. There's disconnection from other people. There's blame. There's hiding. There's isolation. There's disconnection from your spiritual higher power. It's all right there in Genesis 3. And regardless of whether you consider that history or mythology, it's a 2,000 to 4,000 year old book. All the symptoms of PTSD. It just fascinates me. I think the biggest advice is to not try to go it alone. I'm from the 12-step tradition, and I often review the first step, which is we admitted we were powerless over our addiction. And I'll ask people a minute later, what's the first word? And I can't remember, it's we. It's not I, it's we. It's all about community, safe community. We are a traumatized world. I really believe that. To be born is to have some level of stress. Stress writ large is trauma. And ongoing, trauma is what creates PTSD. But all of us get bumped around somewhere. So I think we need to gently address some of these systems to try to help them to look at these principles of creating a safe place. It's just, everybody needs a safe place. Safety means for me that there is a place where I can be vulnerable and not be reshamed by it. The irony is it's a double-edged sword. The very act of being vulnerable is the act that helps us to heal, while at the same time it puts us at risk for being revulnerized or re-victimized. So for me, it's having whether it's a person, small group, or a recovery group, or faith-based space, to be able to really let myself be vulnerable wisely and not be hurt by it.